further ado, let's get into the day. You've met Kent Schneider, the CEO and President of AFCEA yesterday. Kent is going to do the introduction of our morning keynote speaker. Kent.
Good morning. Well, as Jim said, we're going to advance the program a little bit today. Yesterday, we kind of started out with a small business symposium in the morning, and then we focused on cybersecurity, and we focused on critical infrastructure protection. Now we're going to move into some other areas today that include information sharing and intelligence in the Homeland Security arena, emergency management, and others. And so I can't think of anybody more appropriate than our keynote speaker this morning to kick off this second day discussion. General U.S. Air Force retired Mike Hayden certainly doesn't need much introduction in this community. You know him well in his more recent roles. Of course, he spent a career in the Air Force in the intelligence field, and then moved beyond the Air Force to become the director of NSA, as you know, and of course in that role was dual-headed as the director of CSS. Then he was the first principal deputy to the director of national intelligence as that new function was created, and then moved from there to become the director of the CIA. And so we are delighted this morning to have General Hayden here to share with us his perspectives on what's going on in the world of Homeland Security as it relates to intelligence, and he's promised that he's going to give us a little broader perspective than we might otherwise based on the theme for this year's conference. So without further ado, General Hayden, please.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you here this morning. I've looked at the agenda, and it's clear that this conference is what it advertises itself to be. It's Homeland Security across a broad front. So, you know, I'm doing a little soul searching here. What is it I have to add, since you seem to have some very, very specific panels and discussions already arranged. So what I thought I would do is just hit two very broad points. One is cyber, and the other has to do with homegrown extremism. And I realize those are two very different points, but given the broad front that the conference has, I thought they might be acceptable. And within that first Roman numeral in my outline labeled cyber, I've got fewer answers than I have questions. I've got fewer endpoints that I can predict for you than I simply have reporting on what's going on now. But I guess the main point I'd like to make in that first point with regard to cyber is that, for want of a better metaphor, all the metal right now seems to be very, very malleable. There's a lot going on. And what I'd just like to do for you here this morning is to just kind of walk through all the events of about the last 3 or 4 weeks and suggest to you what issues are surfacing with each of those events, and then what it might mean for the future. So let me just jump into the cyber question and give you a few thoughts. I think most of you noticed the President issued an executive order on the cyber question. I think he pushed to the limits, but not beyond what executive authority allows him to do. If you look at the executive order as perhaps a regrettable but necessary step, regrettable and necessary because we didn't get any legislation out of the last Congress. And you had a bill, frankly, Mike Chertoff and I thought it was a pretty decent bill in the Senate, written by Senators Collins and Lieberman, and it's hard to imagine two more center-of-the-road, thoughtful senators than those two. It was just remarkable. I mean, it had I think, a first in American history. Okay? This bill was equally opposed by the American Civil Liberties Union and the American Chamber of Commerce. Now, when was the last time you saw any legislation to have that kind of distinction? Which probably suggests it may have had a few good ideas in it. Okay. Well, it failed. And it was a combination of incentives and kind of disincentives. A goodness kind of embedded in the bill was to protect the owners of critical infrastructure or the owners of the financial system, all the things you and I think are important, was to offer them certain liability protection if they went out and did the right thing in terms of protecting their cyber networks. Now, this thing got real stuck on who gets to decide what the right thing is. But the carrot in all this was liability protection. Well, the president can't offer that. So what you have from the president are kind of bits and pieces from the other part of the bill, but it's beyond his authority to offer the sweetener, to offer the liability protection. So I kind of characterize the executive order as we had the ball 1st and 10 on the 20. We just ran off tackle, and it's 2nd and 8. All right? So, yep, we moved the ball down the field, but it's still 2nd and 8, and we're still deep in our own territory when it comes to the federal government moving forward on this. Interestingly, the day the president issued his executive order, Mike Rogers and Dutch Ruppersberger, okay, Congressman Rogers, chairman of the House Intel Committee, Congressman Rogers, Republican, Michigan, Ruppersberger, Democrat, Maryland. All right. They had a panel discussion at CSIS, not far up the street here, in which they resurrected their bill from the last congressional session. And their bill had an awful lot to do with information sharing. In essence, they were trying to set up incentives and liability protection for business and government to share information back and forth. And by the way, I know in my heart of hearts when that Rogers-Ruppersberger bill says government, that's a euphemism for a 3-letter agency 25 miles north of here on the GW Parkway, all right? It was kind of trying to get NSA and business kind of in an information flow and create the circumstances for greater synchronization and harmonization of what the government's firepower was doing over here and what industrial firepower was doing over there. That bill, by the way, passed the House. The Collins-Lieberman bill never even got to the floor of the Senate. But Rogers-Ruppersberger passed the House. And it passed the House with a pretty wide margin. It wasn't unanimous, but it was bipartisan. It was bipartisan. Never got considered in the Senate. And I frankly was a bit concerned that the president actually threatened to veto the Rogers-Ruppersberger bill if it ever was passed by both houses. He threatened to veto it based upon alleged privacy concerns. Right? Frankly, I think the president wanted the other bill, and so the threat to veto the House bill may have been a tactical decision to make everyone focus on the Collins-Lieberman bill. But I have to tell you, I do not. Okay, truth in lending. I'm the director of CIA and NSA. All right, I've got a history here, but I really don't understand the privacy concerns that were raised about the Rogers-Ruppersberger bill, because they really bent over backwards to amend the bill to accommodate concerns. Here's the way I look at it. Look, this is really hard for us in terms of getting legislation or policy on things cyber. Right? The way I look at it is if you've got a Democrat in control of the White House, the only way we're going to get this boat forward is to tack. And if you've got a Democrat in the White House, I think it's the Democrats' duty to kind of squeeze the privacy lobby. And by the way, when you've got a Republican in the White House, it's his duty to walk across Lafayette Park go up to Tom Donohue's office on the 5th floor of the American Chamber and squeeze the business lobby. I mean, I think that's the only way, that's the only way this ship moves forward. Unfortunately, with a Democrat in the White House, he decided to squeeze right, to squeeze business rather than squeeze left and squeeze the privacy lobby. And therefore, we got no legislation. Okay. There were two newspaper stories about 2 weeks ago now. One in the Washington Post, one in the New York Times. And they were really interesting. And they were the kind of stories where I think nobody had to do a lot of research. You know, somebody got a phone call. I mean, this is one of those authorized leak things where they got a phone call, say, hey, come on down, bring a number 2 pencil and a clean sheet of paper. I'm going to tell you something. Okay. The first story was Ellen Nakashima, who does the cyber reporting for the Washington Post. And Ellen's story said, no, you've been reading about this sequester thing. It's been in all the papers. You understand what's happening to our budget, right? Right? Ellen's story, in the face of everything we're reading and seeing on the 7x24 newscast, was that there was general agreement within the government to increase cyber command by 4,000 billets on a base of 950. That's something. In addition, Ellen's article then went ahead and described how Cyber Command was kind of going to be organized by mission. I mean, this is not the org chart with the boxes, you know. This is just kind of what it is we want them to do. And she came up with 3 kind of clouds. One is defensive government networks. Okay, we got that. We know that. The other is direct support of military operations. Okay, we got that. We you know, support ed, supporting commands. Everyone in this room understands that. The third, national mission forces at U.S. Cyber Command. And the explanation that Ellen had in her article was this would be DOD taking up responsibility for defense of American critical networks outside of American critical networks. Okay. Now that harkens back. Remember Bill Lynn's article in Foreign Affairs about 3 years ago, kind of the seminal American article when it comes to cyber as a domain? I still remember a wonderfully alliterative sentence in the article that U.S. Cyber Command would be censor, sentry, and sharpshooter. And you see this story coming out. And then 2 days later, David Sanger in the New York Times publishes a piece in which he reveals that the policy decision has been made by our government to shoot on warning in the cyber domain. That if we have compelling evidence of an imminent cyber attack against critical infrastructure here, we will not wait for the attack. We will shoot first. Now that, by the way, that seems to be a cyber expression of President Bush's 2002 doctrine of preemption. And coming as it is from a very different administration, it's kind of a remarkable event in its own way. I mean, those 3 things kind of, you know, plus 4,000 billets, national mission forces, shoot on warning, that's interesting stuff. Now, if you don't think it's interesting, that's okay. Think of my former counterparts in intelligence agencies and security agencies around the planet and think about how they're thinking about these storylines that are now appearing in the American press. And then, of course, Kevin Mandia decides to throw his month-long homework assignment out into the public domain. This is the Mandia report on Chinese cyber espionage. And, you know, gets everyone aflutter. Now, I think this applies to everyone in the room, but let me personalize the story. I got interviewed by someone saying, whoa, man, that Mandia report is big news. And I said, well, it's big, but it's not news. You know, anybody who's done this, anybody who's paid attention to this, knows what the Chinese have been doing for years. And, you know, we're still in the knee in the curve here. We're This thing is still going up. Now look, as is already mentioned, I was 6 years the director of the National Security Agency. We steal other people's stuff too. Frankly, I think we're better at it than the Chinese. We're better at it than anyone else in the world. I was in front of a George Washington audience about a week ago doing this, and I said, you know, they're kind of into basketball in the Atlantic Coast Conference, I think they're in. And I just said, hey, we're really good at this. We're number one. Okay. But we self-limit. We and a small number of other countries around the world, all of whom speak English, and that's, you know what I mean. We steal stuff to protect you. We steal stuff to keep you free. We don't steal stuff to make you rich. We don't steal stuff for your commercial benefit. The Chinese do. They do not self-limit. And so I've said publicly to a large number of audiences, I just stand back in awe at the breadth, depth, sophistication, and persistence of the Chinese espionage effort against the United States. Now, after I say that, generally audiences like you say, so what are you going to do about it, Hayden? I mean, what's the response? What is it we ought to do? And frankly, let me try to describe my approach to this. Okay, if this is the kind of the box we're working in, we got cyber attacks coming at. I'm sorry, I should never use that word. Okay, we have cyber espionage coming at us. Attack is a different thing, and they're bleeding us white in terms of economic impact. And the natural instinct is, well, we ought to do something in the cyber domain. Actually, I don't think so. The impacts of this are economic. The reason the Chinese are doing this is economic advantage. I think the reaction, the response from our government should be in the economic sphere. I actually think we have tools in terms of the broad relationship with China that we can punish, and that's the best word I can come up with, we can punish Chinese behavior in the economic sphere because of the impact of Chinese behavior in the economic sphere. And the first thing, oh, we can't do that, we owe them too much money. I don't think so. I really don't. The Chinese economy is more dependent on the American economy than the other way around. And there are a variety of tools that are available to us. Now, I don't want to imply that only the Chinese are doing this. Right? I'm out of government. I actually avoid reading secret stuff so I can talk freely at audiences like this. But my sense is, without that kind of beyond reasonable doubt proof, that we've seen a real surge in Iranian cyber behavior over the past couple of months. You had the Saudi Aramco thing where 30,000 computers were wiped clean by an infection brought in by a thumb drive. Let that be a lesson to all of us. Do not accept them as party favors when you're out there on the road. They made an attack against Rosgas, also in the Persian Gulf. And then, I think quite clearly, the Iranians have conducted significant distributed denial of service attacks against a series of American banks. All right, it's Bank of America, it's JP Morgan Chase, it's Wells Fargo, and the list goes on. Now, I've talked to folks who've been involved in this, who've kind of in the game here, and they've reported to me that there is nothing overly sophisticated about the attacks. But we have never seen them on this scale. And so they really have had an effect, transient, and as I said, serial, not all banks at one time, on our ability to do online banking. That this is actually, we've actually seen these effects. Now look, it's really interesting. In my second life working for the Chertoff group, we talked to a lot of folks affected by this. And we have very, what's the diplomatic language? Frank and wide-ranging discussions, which means you're just short of grabbing the other guy by the throat. All right. When our government is late to need, generally our private sector steps in. And that's another phenomenon that we're witnessing here. That, as our government agonizes over legislation, remember, tacking left, tacking right. You get an executive order that's more than a brick shy of a load because the president can't order everything. As these attacks kind of mount, people who are suffering pain because of them want answers. And again, in our system, if the government isn't answering the question, the private sector says, I think I may be able to help you here. I was out at Aspen a couple of summers ago, and I was on a panel right after lunch in a non-air conditioned building in Aspen. And, you know, all of us on the panel are kind of droning on. I figured, hey, I got to shake this group up. No one's paying attention. So I kind of blurted out the phrase, digital blackwaters are in our future. And that, yeah, I got a little more attention from the audience, and I explained. When the government is late to need, or the government has insufficient resources, we do go to the private sector. And there is now a highly energized private sector who wants to come talk to you about doing more than just selling you some patches for your firewall. And believe me, I'm not suggesting illegal activity on anyone's part here, but I'm just saying definition of defense is growing increasingly aggressive in private sector providers of defense. To give you a sense as to not where the action is, but where the thinking is, I mean, which is a bit ahead of the action, let me refer you to Stuart Baker's blog. Stuart Baker, I mean, Stuart's an iconoclast, but he's not a crazy guy. Stuart was the general counsel at NSA before I got there. Stuart was Secretary Chertoff's head of policy in the Department of Homeland Security. So, I mean, Stuart's a serious guy. You got to read his blog. I mean, he hasn't gone over the edge, but Stuart's on the edge in terms of this private sector involvement. What Stuart describes is, hey, you remember that cowboy movie you watched as a kid? And the bank got robbed and the marshal didn't have sufficient resources, so what did he do? He got the townsfolk in there and says, hey, I need some men, raise your right hand. And for a limited period of time, for a limited purpose, under clear supervision, the private sector assumed responsibilities normally associated with the government entity. But in this circumstance, the government entity's inherent integral organic resources were insufficient. And so Stuart's actually talking about when a private entity is attacked and the government has neither the interest nor the resources to be robust in the response, that why would we not allow private sector? Limited period of time, limited activity, close supervision to take on their own defense. Now, a whole bunch of people think Stuart's crazy. You talk to Jim Lewis at CSIS, who's really good about this. Jim says all that's going to do is create cyber anarchy. But I'm just suggesting when government is late to need, private sector steps in and interesting ideas develop. One or two more things. There was an op-ed 2 days ago in Politico. And if you haven't seen it, I really do recommend it to you. It was co-authored by Tom Ridge and Howard Schmidt. Now, Howard was the administration's cyber czar for several years. He just stepped down just a few months ago. Governor Ridge, you know, is former governor of Pennsylvania, former Secretary of Homeland Security. But Governor Ridge right now is the thought leader inside the American Chamber of Commerce for cyber defense. Remember plot line 1? Collins Lieberman, Chamber of Commerce, privacy, and so on. And so when Governor Ridge signs an op-ed, I think you should take it to reflect developing thoughts of American business on cyber response. And to get Howard Schmidt to sign on, Howard's connective tissue back to the administration is also, I think, reasonably strong. So it creates a really interesting dynamic. And in essence, what the governor and Howard says is, hey, we disagree on a bunch of stuff. Put it aside. We agree on some things. Let's go forward. Let's go forward and do that stuff. He talked about private sector, government sector information sharing, enhancing criminal penalties for cyber crimes, developing a world-class cybersecurity workforce, working on international cooperation. I mean, in essence, I think what you're seeing here is kind of round two of the legislative efforts to move this thing forward and get some structures and institutions in place that make us safer. So again, I commend it to you because it's quite an interesting article, if for no other reasons than for its co-authors and what it might suggest. I'll do one more thing on cyber. All right, I've just spent 20 minutes plus talking to you about cyber in a completely national American context. This is all about stuff happening in the 50 states. It's all about the Congress, all about the president, all about the American private sector. We are arguing in the West, in the United States, but in the West generally, we are arguing about cyber in this kind of what appears to us to be a steel cage death match between security and freedom on the internet. Okay? And if that intrigues you what those issues are, you can bring it up in the Q&A. But I would suggest to you that, you know, in terms of the global discussion about the cyber thing, the poles of the argument inside the United States between the security guys and the freedom guys is only about that wide. We actually are arguing about a pretty small space. And let me tell you why I think that. Because there was a meeting in Dubai in December. It was under the sponsorship of a United Nations organization called the International Telecommunications Union. The ITU is actually the oldest governing body, international governing body still in existence. It goes back to the 19th century. Okay. At the ITU meeting, several nations, led by the Russians and the Chinese, but joined by a whole bunch of developing nations, were trying to push forward an agenda to change the nature of the global internet. Now, the global internet, I mean, I'll quickly describe it for you. It's ubiquitous, you got that. It's egalitarian, everybody can get on it. It's the same no matter where you get on it. And once you're on it, you can go almost anywhere. What the Chinese and the Russians want to do is to take the kind of boundaries and borders we now have in physical space and transfer those boundaries and borders to cyberspace. So that in order to leave your domain, which will now have high walls around it, you may actually need an exit visa, so to speak. All right? I mean, that's destroying the web as we know it. And here we are in the West in this, you know, what seems to be a serious knife fight, arguing about what are genuinely marginal things. And you've got this movement afoot globally to actually destroy that which you and I are trying to make a bit more secure while maintaining the wonderful liberty that it represents. So if you need any kind of argument to kind of get our act together here, there it is. Okay, I promised you a second Roman numeral on this. That's kind of the cyber news. Let me just briefly describe a document that was published yesterday and I think is absolutely critical to the future of policy in terms of our homeland security. Okay? This was a document published by the Henry Jackson Society. It's a British think tank, actually a slightly right-of-center British think tank. And what it is a compendium of terrorism in the United States conducted from within the United States. It's the homegrown thing. Okay? I compared it. Eli Lake called me from Newsweek now and the Daily Beast, called me and said, "Hey, what about this report?" And I said, "Well, Eli, when growing up, my favorite book was the Encyclopedia of Baseball." And I see a couple of folks saying, "Yeah, I'm old enough to remember that." You know, before you could actually just take out your phone and say, what was Hank Aaron's batting average in 1968? All right, you had this book that had it all there. And all the data was there, and it then allowed you to kind of query the data at your own leisure. That's what this book does. It's thick. It's like that. And again, it's not a book to be read. It's, you know, a book to be questioned and to pull data from it. but it really reveals some very interesting facts about the homegrown threat. And look, you know, that cyber thing is hard for us to figure out because of privacy concerns and liberty, but I want it to be secure. Let me tell you, dealing with homegrown extremism is also hard for us to figure out, given our Bill of Rights, our constitutional freedoms, our political culture, and so on. And so I think this document is a wondrous document in that it gives you the data burdened neither by prejudice nor by political correctness. It's the data. And let me just give you a few snapshots from the highlight reel. The report details a danger that's been steadily growing, with statistics showing that the majority of terrorists, again, these are domestic terrorists since the mid-1990s, all right? That the majority of such terrorists, 54%, are U.S. citizens. These terrorists tend to be middle class and well-educated. 60% of them had at least a college education. Over 50% of all the individuals profiled, and these are terrorists who did it in the name of God. We're talking about Islamist terrorism here. 57% of all individuals profiled were employed or in school at the time they were charged with the terrorist incident. And these individuals do not merely have a passing interest in jihad. A third of the American citizens who committed offense had actually received formal terrorist training. Interestingly enough, religious converts to Islam, made up about a quarter of the terrorist threat. I watched a Fox News story on this. Catherine Herridge did it on last night's news. What is the face of terrorism? What is the face of al-Qaeda terrorism in the United States? And her next line was, look in the mirror. I mean, it's not you, but it looks like us. Now, I frankly think this is very important. I can remember I was director of NSA, so I didn't often go to the White House in that job, but I was in the White House shortly before Independence Day in 2002. And we had this massive background chatter that something was going to happen, and that something could very well be on the Mall, where 2 million of our countrymen were going to be cheek by jowl for about 12 hours in just a few days. And I was more of an observer at the meeting. I mean, NSA doesn't have a big role to play in this, but as I watched the meeting, I watched President Bush try to squeeze some options out of all of us in the room. You know, okay, I got it. We got chatter. There could be a danger. What should I do? And frankly, and I'm being a bit cartoonish here, okay? I'm kind of overstating it for effect. But frankly, I left that room kind of thinking, you know, we pretty much just gave the president only two options. Cancel the 4th of July, or put in preventive detention every resident of the United States with a hyphen in their last name. Those are ridiculous options. They're unacceptable options. And only with precision, only with more knowledge, only with the wisdom that comes from data can you begin to narrow that down and give that president or Secretary Napolitano or the Pennsylvania State Police or the Milwaukee Police Force or the police force in Minneapolis-St. Paul or Dearborn or Fremont a really accurate description of what it is they should and should not be worried about. I think it's a wonderful effort. I think it will stand the test of time. I think the next step is to take this data and take it to Fremont and take it to Dearborn and take it to Minneapolis-St. Paul and to talk to community leaders in those cities, in those heritage communities, and learn from them what impressions this data creates in their minds about their own communities, so that as we move forward, okay, we continue to keep ourselves safe and don't change our DNA as a free and welcoming society. I think it's really important. By the way, that issue of how do I be secure yet maintain my freedom and my openness is fundamentally the same issue behind every one of those points I made in the cyber domain. How do you go forward and preserve those two very highly valued things for us? And with that, I promised the organizers that I'd leave time for questions, and you got 14 minutes, so here I am. Or not. Sir, I think they want you to go to the mic. Okay.
Sir, thank you for your time. My name is Robert Nowak from Reprieva. We're a wireless, commercial wireless company that provides Type 1 encryption. And moving from a strategic perspective to a more tactical one, NSA has endorsed a new approach for the development of devices that can process what is traditionally known as Type 1 information using commercial protocols rather than government protocols. And under your tutelage, actually, NSA developed protocols that helped promote and perfected interoperability between the departments, Five Eyes, NATO, coalition partners. Can you give us your opinion on the new approach of this COT solution for classified, if you will?
Yeah, boy, thank you for the question. I'm going to be really efficient, but it brings up all sorts of realities inside this thing. Let me just give you one thought, just to kind of stir the pot, and then I'll go very specific for a liberal arts major on your question. So I remember I'm doing this government-private sector thing. You know, look, in this organization, there's military experience here to beat the band. Y'all remember when you got that op order? It told you who the supported command was, right? And then it told you who were the supporting command. Y'all know the distinction, right? Okay, in this cyber thing, government, private sector, who's supported? Who's supporting? I actually think we don't know the answer to that yet. But my instincts are, I think we're going to end up, and this is tied to your question, we're going to end up with the private sector being the support-dead command. And because you guys own 95% of this thing. And the government will be supporting. So I am comfortable with the approach to COTS and kind of unleashing the private sector. I was in Tel Aviv for something like this. I was on a couple of panels for the Israeli Institute of Security Studies on cyber. And I was joined there by a fellow named Ralph Langner. Ralph is now non-resident fellow at Brookings. Ralph is the fellow who discovered Stuxnet in the wild and decomposed it and explained it. Ralph and I struck up deep conversations, none of them about Stuxnet. But Ralph has this model. He's kind of got the threat pyramid here, and he's got, you know, nasty, ill-adjusted people in their mom's basement, all the way up to very complex, powerful, rich nation states. He says what we ought to be doing, and if my left arm here is now what it is we're doing, and I've got this pyramid, what we need to be doing is solutions like you're suggesting that erase the lower order threats, that take the lower order threats off your threat scope. And if you think of them as hacktivists, criminal gangs, and nation states, I think commercial solutions get you significantly through criminal gangs, not completely, but much of the criminal gang threat and almost all of the disaffected young people's threat is now off your scope. And I think that's actually a very logical approach, using commercially available solutions to then allow more high-powered entities to go ahead and deal with the things that are remaining. Okay? You got to follow on. Okay?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. You got to follow on.
Just a quick follow comment. But the reason we had government protocols was to promote interoperability.
Right.
Interoperability with commercial companies is extremely difficult because they all put their own twist on it to some extent.
Yep.
Because theirs is better, they answer more of the space. So we get into a situation where A won't talk to B and B certainly won't talk to C. So the government promoted the.
No, I understand. And I mean, a question back, and I'll make it rhetorical because we'll move on. You know, isn't there a market case? Aren't there market pressures that ultimately would drive business to more interoperable solutions. Sir.
General, thanks for your remarks. Jim Williams, you talked about needing the Congress to pass legislation that provides a legal liability framework or the safe harbor. I assume those would come with certain criteria about what qualifies you for a safe harbor. And I just want to ask, what do you think some of those criteria might be? And a second part of the question is, as I look at the executive order, it looks like it's focused on the back end, continuous monitoring, information sharing, and the balance of putting things up front, like secure authentication, we'll be talking about in the next panel. I don't see much of an emphasis on that upfront part of the defense, which is always less costly. And I guess I just would like to hear your thoughts on both.
Again, I'll be less general than I think will be satisfying for you, but one of the issues of the government imposing standards and requirements that then says that's safe and that's not, that's protected from liability, that's not, is, in my view, the government is in a permanent tail chase for what constitutes adequate behavior. And the great danger of going down, here the government's got, here's what you got to do, is now you've got people with a compliance mindset, checking the boxes, but without a real focus on legitimate active defense. I don't have a happy, easy answer as to how you get standards that are living, breathing, and changing. All right, I don't, and that's really the fundamental issue. I think we will figure it out. I think we will do it. But the great danger, and look, I'm Truth in Lending, I'm a fellow at the Chamber, that's why I know a little bit about Governor Ridge's thinking. And the Chamber is, number one, the Chamber is deathly afraid of regulation, just as a matter of philosophy. All right, and frankly, to be honest, particularly in current times, all right, there's a real allergy to it. But they're also very much concerned about regulation leading to a compliance mindset, and that just won't get us to where we have to be. Yeah. Others?
Hi, sir. Jeff Gardner. I work for People Technology Processes, just retired from the Army. My question has to do with interagency information sharing. You got great experiences to talk about this, and when I was in the military, there were places I was assigned where we had all the agencies together, but still we couldn't connect anything. Information sharing was still physical. Are we ever going to get to the point where we can, it's not a technology problem, it's a policy issue. Are we ever going to get to the point where we can get over our own policies and regulations to effectively share information?
Yeah, I mean, there's a move afoot, and Jim Clapper, I think he kind of snatched at it based upon what he thought might be economies of scale in terms of ICITE, intelligence community, integrated IT environment. I think the first gleam in their eye had to do with cost, and we could push costs down. But if you move this to a cloud and a limited number of clouds, and I think the limited number right now is 2, one being built at NSA and one being bought by CIA. Interesting, right? One being built at NSA, one being bought by CIA. And then you allow everyone else to kind of tuck in under those clouds. You begin to develop convergence. Now look, I got to tell you, my last agency is the most conservative. I'm being kind with my choice of words here. Most conservative when it comes to information sharing. All right? And so this is going to be a gradual process. And as mentioned, I was first principal deputy director of national intelligence, a line in my bio that I don't emphasize, okay? Just because the D&I thing is just so hard. But, you know, hidden way back in the ranks of government bureaucracy was ICD 501, which has to do with information sharing. And over time, that Intelligence Community Directive is going to have the impact of the Goldwater-Nichols sentence back in 1986 that said the promotion rates of officers on the Joint Staff shall be equal to or greater than the promotion rates of the officers on the military headquarters staff, which set in motion a cultural process that General Dubia is smiling about, that everyone in the Air Force who actually, or Army or Navy, actually wanted to be a general said, I got to get me a job on the Joint Staff. And it just created a different dynamic, which changed the center of gravity of staff strength in the Pentagon, because it used to, all the firepower used to be in the military departments, And then all the firepower ended up on the second floor, on the Joint Staff. But it took time. It took 15 years for that to develop. I think we're on that trajectory. We really are. I'll give you a good news story. WikiLeaks didn't break the trajectory. Because if that was going to be stopped, there could be a whole bunch of people who say, you see, I told you. Now, a lot of people actually said that. But it was how we implemented it, not the philosophy. And so I'm modestly optimistic we get to where you're suggesting. The arc is going in the right direction. It's just going to take a while. Any others?
I'll ask a follow-up if there's nobody.
Yep, all right.
It's even harder when you go, I've been working since I left the military. Now I'm working with fusion centers, state and local officials, Homeland Security and FBI down at the state and local level. And that's even more of a challenge, particularly when we talk about the threat of Homeland Security, particularly when you talk about U.S. citizens. There's things that we can do, as you well know, at the national level that you can't do at the state and local level.
No, I mean, this goes back to kind of my underlying thematic for both the cyber thing and the domestic terrorist thing affiliated with Al-Qaeda. These are fundamental issues of American values. Right? Now, we all say, oh, that wall between law enforcement and intelligence, man, that was awful. Man, if we didn't have that wall, and then I ask you, do you want your personal data commingled with NSA data? Okay. I mean, let me give you an example. To go get a FISA, all right? My bar as director of NSA was much lower than the FBI's bar to go get a FISA, because I was doing it for foreign intelligence purposes, and therefore the only thing I could hurt was your privacy. I could not put it to a purpose that would actually cost you your liberty, which is actually what the FBI is doing. Okay? So therefore my bar was here, the FBI bar was here. Now, do you want to set up circumstances where it's easy and facile to commingle my data gathered through a lower bar over here with American law enforcement, whose data requires a much higher bar? I mean, you see the issue. And so you get these, these are actually, you're right, they're policy questions, but they're very important policy questions. And the easy answer is, well, if you do it, you'll be more secure, is only one argument. You've got this other argument, yes, but you might be less free. Let me give you an example. Look, I made a good living for 6 years reading other people's emails as the director of the National Security Agency, all right? I freely admit it. But when this Petraeus thing explodes, and then I learn along with you that the FBI can access your opened emails if they're on a server longer than 6 months without going to a judge. Even a former director of NSA says, what the hell was that about? I mean, we're all part of a broad American political culture that values our liberty. And there will be times, and I've lived the case, there will be times when you make the choice, we're going to be a little less safe because we're not going to go do that. So,
Thanks for your service.
Thank you, and yours. Okay.
That was absolutely terrific, and what a great way to start the day off, and to get everybody thinking at the strategic level. I know a couple things I took away from that one is I'm proud that we're number one. That's first of all. I'm ready to be deputized to help go get those bad guys anytime I can. And if we think the Secure Border Initiative's tough now, wait till we have to do the Secure Border Cyber Initiative down the road based on what we heard going on in China and Russia. General, that was absolutely terrific. We appreciate it immensely for you to take time from your busy schedule. And on behalf of AFCEA International, we have a book here. We have an author coming to speak to us tomorrow. This is sort of another version of what a second-generation Homeland Security might look like in a more federalistic kind of approach. We know you can add this to your already vast reading materials, and since you're not reading emails anymore, here's a book to read. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.